Now, the next opening statement is going to be made by Mr. Maxwell-Scott, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of RBKC. So if you're ready, Mr. Maxwell-Scott, come up and give us your statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Istefan, Mr. Akbor, as you know, we have submitted a 50-page written opening. We also last week provided the inquiry with a document identifying some key changes made within the Council since June 2017 that are relevant to Module 4 issues. In this oral statement, I'm not going to repeat everything we have said in our detailed written opening. I will focus on a number of specific topics which I will list at the end of this introduction. By way of introduction, I should explain that the Council has a key role to play in this module. This role has nothing to do with the fact that the Council was the owner and landlord of Grenfell Tower. The Council's role stems from the fact that, as a local authority, it was a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. The TMO was not a Category 1 or Category 2 responder. It owed no duties under that legislation. So this isn't like Module 3, where the role of a TMO as a Council's managing agent was central to the issues under consideration. This is much more like Module 1, where the Council's building control function had nothing to do with the TMO and nothing to do with the fact that the Council happened to be the owner and landlord of Grenfell Tower. As a Category 1 responder, the Council had a vital role to play if an emergency took place within the borough. It would be expected to lead the recovery effort, and in particular, to lead on the provision of shelter, welfare, rest centres, and other forms of humanitarian assistance. The Council was also under a duty to undertake contingency planning so that it would be prepared should an emergency arise in the borough. Mr. Chairman, the immediate aftermath was an exceptionally difficult time for the bereaved survivors and residents. It was made worse by the fact that the Council-led recovery phase was not as organised or as effective as it could and should have been. On this point, I would like to quote from the speech given by Elizabeth Campbell on the 19th of July 2017. This is a speech she gave immediately after she was formally elected as leader of the Council. She said, "We did not cope well enough in our initial response to the tragedy. I am deeply sorry for the grief and trauma that you are suffering. I am deeply sorry that we did not do more to help you when you needed it the most." In our written opening statement, we have sought to analyse both the Council's emergency preparations and its response to the fire, and to do so in the light of the Council's commitment to candour. Having done so, we have identified and set out a number of specific failings on the part of the Council. They are set out in our written opening, but I will mention some of the most significant ones now. The arrangements which the Council had in place before the fire failed to set out how different parts of the Council would coordinate their communications. The Council failed to provide the public with clear, consistent communications after the fire. As a result, individual residents missed out on receiving support to which they were entitled. The Council's provision of rest centres was initially disorganised. The lack of visible leadership from the Council contributed to the problem. The Council had not trained enough rest centre managers. There was a shortage of senior managers at rest centres on the 14th of June. The Council did not run an adequate number of emergency response training events and exercises before the fire. There was insufficient attendance at the training events and exercises that were held. The Council apologises for its failings. Mr. Chairman, the scale and complexity of the problems which had to be addressed in the immediate aftermath were unprecedented in London in peacetime. A huge number of people provided assistance that made a real difference. Had they not done so, things would have been far worse than they were. On behalf of the Council, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the people from the local community and further afield who assisted at a time of great need, and to thank all the local community organisations, faith groups and charities who worked with the local community to deliver that assistance. The Council also wishes to express its thanks to those councillors and council officers who worked long hours and willingly took on unfamiliar tasks. There are 8 topics which I will address you on in this opening. They are: 1, leadership; 2, communication with the public; 3, local community organisations; 4, rest centres, hotels and financial assistance; 5, the Council's contingency planning team and contingency management plan; 6, training and exercises; 7, the needs of specific groups; and 8, the activation of the London Gold arrangements. Mr. Chairman, you'll be aware from this list that I am adopting a slightly different structure to my written opening. This is deliberate and is done to enable people more clearly to see the connection between some of the failings in pre-fire preparations and what happened in the response. I should make it clear in this opening statement, we do not address any events that took place after the 20th of June 2017. This is for the simple reason that the inquiry has stated that in this module it is focusing on the first 7 days. The Council acknowledges that there were shortcomings in its emergency relief response in the period after the 20th of June, as well as in the 7 days before then. I turn first to the Council's leadership in the immediate aftermath. It is important to try and understand the nature of the challenges faced by it in those early days. There was the need to lead a humanitarian response of unprecedented scale and complexity, but that was not the only challenge. The leadership was under pressure from the highest levels of central government. It also found itself in the middle of the biggest national news story of the day, with large numbers of media organisations raising questions about the causes of the fire. Central government's interest was understandable, and the media's questions were legitimate, but that did not make the challenge any less. In addition, within a short period of time, the Council faced hostility over whether the Council bore responsibility for the fire itself and over the effectiveness of a humanitarian response. This was an unusual situation. By many, the Council was not seen as an organisation seeking, however imperfectly, to solve a crisis caused by an event such as a flood, which was outside its control. The Council was instead seen by many as the cause of the crisis, rather than part of the solution. In the face of these challenges, the Council accepts that its leadership was unable to cope in the days after the fire. The Council apologises for the fact that it was unable to do so. One area which in our submission the Council's leadership got right was recognising the need to spend whatever was required to address the humanitarian crisis. I turn next to the issue of communication with the public. I do so at an early stage in this statement because we consider that the Council's communication failures were a significant cause of other problems with the Council's response. For example, They weakened the Council's public profile and hampered its ability to provide visible leadership or visible coordination. Whenever there is a major emergency, the public need accurate information and reliable advice. They need that information and advice to be easily accessible, and they need it to be regularly reviewed and refreshed so that it remains up to date. As a Category 1 responder, the Council had a duty to maintain arrangements to provide information and advice to the public in the event of an emergency. The Council admits that the arrangements that it had in place were not capable of providing the level of service needed by the public after the fire. They were not as clear or well understood as they should have been. They failed to set out how different parts of the Council would coordinate their communications. And they were not set up to enable the Council to speak with one voice, clearly and accurately. The Council's media and communications team was small. Its main functions were those of a press office, responding to media inquiries and issuing press releases. There had been a failure before the fire adequately to exercise the emergency communication plan. These pre-fire problems had a causative impact on the Council's response after the fire. The Council failed to provide the public with clear, consistent communications in the immediate aftermath. Information was not cascaded effectively, either internally within the Council or externally. As a result, there was inconsistency in the information provided by the Council to residents. A key theme that emerges from the witness statements is of some residents not receiving support which other residents were receiving, either because they were not told that they were entitled to it, or because they were actively told that they were not entitled to it. It is wholly understandable that this inconsistency in delivery frustrated residents and offended their natural sense of fairness. The Council apologises unreservedly for its communications failures. It deeply regrets the unfairness that was caused and the fact that individual residents missed out on receiving support which they were entitled to and which the Council wished to provide to them. Mr. Chairman, the position has changed since 2017. There is now a crisis communications strategy, a crisis communications plan, and a new communications team. The team has been trained and has 2 officers on call, 24/7, 365 days a year. My third topic is local community organisations, faith groups and charities. North Kensington was and is an area with tight-knit communities and close community ties. Many local community organisations were embedded in the community and had been providing valuable support to local residents for decades. Within minutes of the fire occurring, while most of London was asleep, local individuals and local community organisations sprang into action, used their initiative, opened their premises, and started to help survivors. They had no obligation to do so, but they did, and the Council is deeply grateful to them for doing so. Although they were under no legal obligation to do so, the fact that they did could not be described as unforeseeable. Quite the opposite. Experience from other national events clearly shows that it is in fact the norm for local community organisations to be first on the scene. That they were at Grenfell was both foreseeable and predictable. Given the likelihood that they would be first on the scene, the Council considers that it should have done more before the fire to liaise with them and to include them within its emergency plans. This is particularly so because very few council officers lived within the borough. The fact that the council did not do so impeded the effectiveness of the response. A number of witnesses described local community organisations experiencing a lack of overall direction from the council. A greater level of pre-fire liaison would have meant that the council was better placed to coordinate and direct local community organisations when they were most needed. In summary, the council should have done more before the fire to liaise with local community organisations and include them within its emergency plans. It should have done more to harness, coordinate and direct the outpouring of community support which arose spontaneously in the immediate aftermath of the fire. Since 2017, the council has made considerable efforts to improve its approach to community engagement and to support local community organisations, faith groups and charities. The council has established a communities department and created a donations plan. These community engagement structures have been used in recent years in response to events such as the COVID pandemic, the arrival of evacuees from Afghanistan, and the war in Ukraine. My fourth topic is rest centres, hotels and financial assistance. On the morning of the 14th of June, some of the most important priorities were staff for rest centres, ensuring that residents had somewhere to sleep that night, and consolidating services into a single rest centre when it was appropriate to do so. The evidence suggests that at least 5 separate premises opened as formal or informal rest centres before 9 a.m. that morning. The council did recognise these priorities and did seek to address them. However, the council acknowledges that it found itself constantly trying to catch up with events. To the best of the council's knowledge, no council officers were present at any of the 5 premises before approximately 9 a.m. Rest centres, including the Westway, which opened later that morning, were initially disorganised. The lack of visible leadership from the council contributed to the problem. The situation was not helped by the fact that many council officers who attended rest centres did not wear anything that visibly indicated the identity of their employer. This understandably led many to believe that the council was invisible, was not providing help, and did not care. The services provided at rest centres on the 14th of June focused on residents' most immediate needs. This should not be regarded as unexpected. The guidance documents envisage that the services provided within the first 24 hours of an emergency will be more limited than those provided after 48 hours. By the 20th of June, a wide range of goods and services were available at the Westway. These included food and drinks, clothes, Oyster cards and mobile telephones, housing advice, adult social care, children's services, healthcare, welfare and emotional support. They also included assistance with replacement documents, such as passports, visas and driving licenses. Moving on to hotels, the council's aim was to ensure that every Grenfell Tower resident who needed emergency hotel accommodation on the first night was offered it. Over 70 households were accommodated in hotels that night. Most of them were Grenfell Tower residents. Council acknowledges that there is evidence of a small number of Grenfell Tower residents not being told about this option in circumstances where they should have been. There is a big difference between staying in a hotel out of choice and staying in a hotel out of necessity. being forced to stay in a hotel for an indefinite period of time, where you've lost your home and all your possessions, is not in any way enjoyable. The Council understands this. It acknowledges that some residents were justifiably dissatisfied with the quality and suitability of the hotel accommodation. The Council also acknowledges that some residents had to move hotel rooms within the first 7 days as a result of hotels honouring pre-existing bookings. The reality is that this was very far from an ideal situation. Booking a large number of hotel rooms at minimal notice in central London in mid-June is far from easy. Finding hotel rooms for over 70 households on the first night took a lot of work and should be regarded as an achievement. It was inevitable that some hotels would be of a higher quality or in a better location than others. Finally, in this topic, I will briefly mention financial assistance. Initially, the aim was to provide each household with £500 in cash. By the 19th of June, the plan was for there to be a further payment of £5,000 for households from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk. Council officers worked together with the Post Office and central government to facilitate this. I end this topic by returning to a theme I've mentioned already: the fact that failures in communication resulted in inconsistency in the delivery of services. There is clear evidence that some residents were not aware how much money they were entitled to. There is also clear evidence that some residents were not aware of the full range of services they were entitled to receive for free while they were staying in hotels. This is a matter of deep regret to the Council, and it apologises for it. My fifth topic is the Council's contingency planning team and contingency management plan. The contingency planning team was responsible for the contingency management plan and for training and exercises. The team consisted of the contingency planning manager, David Kerry, and 2 contingency planning officers. There was no formal training programme for them, but all 3 of them were involved in a wide range of internal and multi-agency training sessions and exercises. All 3 of them were suitably qualified and experienced for their roles. Kerry, in particular, had a wealth of relevant experience going back to the 1980s. He had been the Council's contingency planning manager since 2005 and had been head of contingency planning at another London local authority before that. Kerry chaired the Kensington and Chelsea Borough Resilience Forum and was active in regional working groups and committees. Most notably, Kerry had been the practitioner advisor to the local authorities panel to the London Resilience Forum since it was set up. On a day-to-day basis, this team of 3 had little direct input from the officers in the line management chain above Kerry. There were some occasions on which the team provided reports to councillors or more senior officers, and there is some evidence of councillors and officers providing oversight of the team's work. Having considered this evidence, the Council's position is that there should have been more internal reporting up the management chain, and that there should have been greater oversight of both the team itself and the Council's emergency response capability. The Council had a contingency management plan. The plan included a reference to a fire in a block of flats, and there were annexes that were intended to address an emergency situation in which residents of the borough could, for whatever reason, not return to their homes and required humanitarian assistance. The plan contained a large number of useful annexes. The council had a mass evacuation and shelter plan, an emergency shelter and rest centre directory, guidance for setting up a community assistance centre, and an assistance centre manual. However, it did not have a standalone humanitarian assistance plan. The council admits that it should have done. In addition, the council admits that both Part 2 of the plan and Annex 21 were incomplete draft documents which should have been finalised. In recent years, the council has improved both its oversight of contingency planning and its contingency management plan. The leader of the council is now the portfolio holder for contingency planning. The council has also created a contingency planning assurance group. Its most recent meeting was chaired by the chief executive. The contingency management plan has been revised and a number of new annexes have been added, including an emergency centres plan and a donations plan. The council now has a by-borough humanitarian assistance plan. My sixth topic is training and exercises. The regulations and the guidance documents are clear on the importance of exercising the emergency plan and training staff so that they know what to do in an emergency. This is therefore an important topic, and we devote 8 pages to it in our written opening. Training sessions and training exercises are never going to be as realistic as real events, but they represent the best preparation that can be provided for the wide range of emergency scenarios that could arise. Because the range is wide, it is not realistic to expect a local authority to put on training sessions and exercises for every possible scenario, and there is no requirement to do so. The theory is that sessions and exercises will enable staff to cope when faced with a factual scenario that they have not specifically encountered in training. We concluded our section on this topic in our written opening by identifying 5 main areas in which the council fell short. What I'm going to do today is to explain what those 5 areas were. Having done so, I will briefly identify some other relevant points. 1. The council did not have formal training programmes for Council Gold, Council Silver, or officers who worked in the Borough Emergency Command Centre. There was no requirement for it to do so, but the council accepts that its training programmes should have been more formalised. 2. The council failed to keep and retain sufficient records of emergency response training. This has limited our ability to set out a detailed position on the frequency of training exercises and the level of attendance at them by council staff. However, the council is able to say 3, that not enough training events were held, and 4, that the level of attendance at the training events that were held was insufficient. As a result, the cohort of trained officers was too small to ensure that there would always be enough officers available to perform the required roles in the event of an emergency. These are issues that were identified at the time, and efforts were made to address them, but they had only limited success. The council's strategy at the time was to focus on encouraging more officers to volunteer to be trained up. The reality is that this strategy of relying on unpaid volunteers did not work. It did not produce enough volunteers. Since 2017, the council has adopted a different strategy. It now pays officers who agree to do this work a supplement to their annual salary. This has had results. the number of trained officers now exceeds that recommended by resilient standards for London. The final area, number 5, relates to the exercising of a contingency management plan. The plan stated, quotes, "This contingency management plan shall be exercised at least once annually," close quotes. The Council considers that in order validly to exercise the plan, it would have been necessary to exercise it at all levels. In other words, Gold, Silver, and Borough Emergency Command Centre staff. The Council admits that it failed to do so at least once annually. At least some Council officers participated in relevant exercises at least once per year, but the Council did not exercise the plan at all levels each year. This is another area where things have changed since 2017. The contingency management plan is now exercised at all levels twice a year. It has also been activated and used to address the COVID pandemic and the provision of accommodation for evacuees from Afghanistan. Finally, on training and exercises, a few other relevant points. As well as participating in internal training events, Council officers also participated in training exercises run at London-wide level by the London Resilience Group. In the 3 years before the fire, Council officers took part in 6 training exercises organised by London Resilience. The 2 Council officers who performed the role of Council Silver in the immediate aftermath were David Kerry and Stuart Priestley. They had both received sufficient training to enable them to do so. The Council's Chief Executive, Nicholas Holgate, was expected to assume the role of Council Gold in the event of an emergency, and did so on the morning of the 14th of June. He had undergone training both with the Council and with London Resilience. Holgate had received some training from the Council, but we acknowledge that it was not of itself sufficient for the role of Council Gold. However, that does not represent the totality of the training which Holgate had received. There was and is a London-wide system under which, at any one time, 2 of the chief executives of the 33 London local authorities are on call to assist as London Local Authority Gold. By June 2017, Holgate had been a chief executive for several years. London Resilience had placed him on its on-call rota, and he had served as on-call Primary London Gold and on-call Secondary London Gold. We know that Holgate had received some training from London Resilience, but the details are not clear to us. This is a matter which the inquiry may wish to explore in the Module 4 hearings. Doing so will enable the inquiry to form a view on whether the combination of the training that Holgate had undertaken with the Council and the training that he had undertaken with London Resilience was sufficient for the roles of London Local Authority Gold and Council Gold. My 7th topic is the needs of specific groups, and I will be addressing both emergency planning issues and the events after the fire. I should make it clear that I will not be addressing planning for the emergency evacuation of residents with vulnerabilities from a building that is on fire. That issue has been considered extensively in Module 3, which, in our submission, was the appropriate module in which to consider it. The emergency planning guidance documents contain 2 themes which appear to some extent to be in tension with each other. The first is the need specifically to consider vulnerable persons when engaging in emergency planning. The second is the difficulty of maintaining accurate, up-to-date lists of vulnerable individuals. The way in which the guidance documents attempt to resolve the tension between these two themes is the idea of creating lists of lists. What this means is that rather than creating a master list of all vulnerable persons living in a borough, a local authority creates a list of organisations that should themselves hold lists of vulnerable persons known to them. The Council considers that its contingency management plan did achieve that basic requirement. I say this because Annex 1 of the plan did list contact details for the TMO, Children's Services, and Adult Social Care. The TMO had agreed in April 2016 that in the event of a future incident involving more than a couple of its homes, it would provide details of known vulnerabilities. Turning then to events after the fire, on the morning of the 14th of June, Children's Services took steps to identify all children previously known to it and attempted to contact them or their families. Social workers were deployed to rest centres and hospitals. All relevant local schools were contacted with an offer of critical incident support, and educational psychologists were deployed to schools. Also that morning, a council officer accessed the IT system and searched for adults living in Grenfell Tower known to Adult Social Care. Before 7:15 a.m, she sent an email stating that she had identified 7 people to whom Adult Social Care had provided services and 25 people over 65 years old. The Council admits that it should have done more in the immediate aftermath to make people from diverse backgrounds feel as comfortable as possible. In particular, Muslim residents who were observing Ramadan at the time. The Council acknowledges that many survivors who stayed in hotels were not provided with halal food. The Council also admits that effort should have been made to communicate key messages in languages other than English. My final topic is the Council's request for mutual aid and the activation of the London Gold arrangements. First, some points about terminology. It seems to us that the term mutual aid can give rise to some confusion. Our reading of the evidence is that it has been used to describe the following 3 different forms of assistance to a local authority. 1. The aid provided to a local authority that has activated the London Gold arrangements. 2. Aid provided to a local authority that has made a formal request for aid to one or more local authorities but has not activated the London Gold arrangements. 3. Any aid provided by one local authority to another, however informally. Our position is that the Council activated the London Gold arrangements in the late afternoon of the 15th of June, and that the formal transfer to London Gold was completed before 2 p.m. on the 16th of June. Thereafter, John Baradell, the Chief Executive of the City of London Corporation, became Recovery Gold. That was how he was described in the minutes of ministerial meetings after the formal transfer. The formal transfer therefore took place over 48 hours after the fire started. The Council considers that the formal transfer should have taken place earlier than it did. The reasons why it did not will be explored in Module 4, when all of the key witnesses on this issue are scheduled to give oral evidence. At this stage, I'm going to limit myself to identifying 2 themes which we invite the panel to bear in mind when considering the evidence on this issue. First, because of the tri-borough and bi-borough agreements, the Council was able to draw on resources from Westminster City Council and the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham without activating the London Gold arrangements. The panel may wish to consider the extent to which the Council requested, was offered, accepted, and received mutual aid in the immediate aftermath. Secondly, in the period before London Gold was activated, the London Local Authority Coordination Centre was preparing for the possibility that London Gold would be activated. It was not operating from a standing start at 2 p.m. on the 16th of June. That concludes my final topic today. As you know, we cover a wider range of topics in our written opening statement and also analyse the evidence in more detail there. That evidence will be added to by the evidence of witnesses due to be called in April and May. In our closing statement, we will take account of that evidence and set out the Council's position in further detail and in accordance with the Council's commitment to candour.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Maxwell-Scott. We're now due to hear, or next we're going to hear, a statement on behalf of the Mayor of London, but the timetable suggests that we should have our afternoon break rather earlier than usual, but at this point, because the Mayor's statement may take a little while. So I think we'll stick to the timetable and we'll stop now. We'll come back at 3 o'clock when we shall hear Miss Anne Studd, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Mayor of London. Thank you very much. 3 o'clock, please. We're now going to hear an opening statement on behalf of the Mayor of London by Miss Anne Studd, Queen's Counsel. Yes, Miss Studd.
Mr. Chairman, it's clear from the evidence disclosed by the bereaved survivors and residents in Module 4 that they were failed in the immediate aftermath of the fire. Over those first days, the community was badly let down by an ineffective humanitarian response and inadequate leadership. All those with a role responding to this tragedy need to examine what happened and consider what lessons need to be learned so that in future those that require the safety net that the system should have put in place will benefit from it. The inquiry will want to consider the system of resilience in London that was in place in 2017 and how the jigsaw should have fitted together in practical terms on the ground. In his written opening, the Mayor of London has set out in some detail the statutory framework for resilience as it applied in London in 2017. As the panel will see, it involved a number of interlinked strands, and the Mayor does not intend to repeat that part of the written submission in this oral opening. He will, however, outline the Mayor of London's specific role in the resilience framework, as it's important for the inquiry to appreciate what he was able to do in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, and indeed where he was not able to assist. In this oral opening, we will cover the Mayor of London's role within the statutory resilience framework for London, the Mayor of London's role between the 14th and the 20th of June 2017, and we will deal with particular elements of resilience decision-making in the aftermath of the fire and the key concerns raised by the BSRs in relation to the response of the TMO, central and local government, and in that aftermath period. And very shortly, preliminary observations on recommendations. Those will obviously be developed more fully at the conclusion of the evidence in this module. I start with the Mayor's role within the statutory resilience framework for London. The Greater London Authority differs from other Category 1 responders because it's a statutory body and as such is limited to carrying out the functions expressly conferred upon it by the Greater London Authority Act 1999. As a strategic authority, the GLA's role is quite different from the London Local Authority roles. Section 2 of the GLA Act states that the GLA shall consist of the Mayor of London and the London Assembly. The London Assembly consists of 25 members. The executive and decision-making responsibilities of the GLA are vested in the Mayor, whilst through its committee and plenary sessions, the London Assembly scrutinises the work of the Mayor, but has very restricted decision-making powers. There is a wide general power under Section 30 of the GLA Act, which permits the GLA to do anything which furthers one of its principal purposes. But that wide power is limited by and must be read in conjunction with Section 31 of the Act, which expressly prevents the GLA from providing any health or social services which could be provided by a London Borough Council or any other public body. The GLA's powers are limited to incurring expenditure in, cooperating with, or facilitating or coordinating the activities of other bodies providing those services. This explains why the GLA did not take on a more operational role in response to the Grenfell Tower fire. The Cabinet Office guidance notes that as the elected leader of London's regional government, the Mayor of London plays a full part in supporting the effective implementation of the Act and improving the preparedness of the capital. Chapter 9 of the guidance, which was last revised in 2012, sets out specific requirements of the Mayor and the GLA as follows. 1. Engagement in high-level discussions and decisions relating to the management of emergencies in London. 2. Chairing the London Resilience Forum. In 2017, this function was deputised to Fiona Twycross, the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience. 3. Contributing as necessary to the pre-informing of Londoners about the content of emergency plans, the correct behaviour in an emergency, and good practice in terms of preparedness in the home, as part of initiatives organised both locally and at the UK level. 4. Playing a key role in warning and informing the public during an emergency in London. And 5. Taking responsibility for civil protection issues in connection with the management of the two squares, Parliament Square and Trafalgar Square, as part of its general statutory responsibilities. The Strategic Coordination Protocol sets out the strategic coordination arrangements for escalating a multi-agency response to an emergency or major incident in London. The implementation of any plans in a pan-London response to an emergency is through the Strategic Coordination Group. In the event of such an emergency or major incident, the Mayor's Office will require initial and regular information about the situation. The Mayor will collaborate closely with the Strategic Coordination Group and, where appropriately, central government, including attending COBRA meetings if invited. However, the key role for the Mayor in response to an emergency is acting as the voice of London in order to provide clear and coordinated information and guidance. Publicly, the Mayor's role is to support the operational response to an emergency in London by providing that unified voice. This requires him to provide leadership, regional information and reassurance throughout the duration of the response and into the initial stages of the recovery. This role is complementary to and in support of local responders and operational spokespeople. In addition to press briefings, the Mayor's social media channels may be used to communicate key information and reassurance messages. There are various internal arrangements in place to assist with the Mayor's civic leadership as part of his role as Voice for London, including a Mayor's Advisory Group, which for reasons set out in the written opening was not utilised, and I say no more about that. But the gold cell procedure was used and had been established to support the Mayor's response to a dynamic incident. The gold cell comprised an internal group of senior GLA officers that convened to share information and ensure that the operation of the Mayor's Office and the GLA were coordinated during the response to an emergency. The Mayor does not himself attend a gold cell. The gold cell enables the Mayor to quickly receive relevant and current information about the emergency and the operational response to it, to enable him to provide appropriate information to the general public and the relevant stakeholders. The gold cell procedure can be activated by the Chief of Staff or a senior officer acting on his behalf, or the GLA duty officer. It was activated in the course of the response to the Grenfell Tower fire. The gold cell procedure does not impact on the operational command of the incident, as the GLA does not have any operational responsibilities. Rather, it is designed to provide the Mayor with up-to-date information during a fast-moving incident. While the Mayor, as the executive arm of the GLA, has a Category 1 responder function, he has no operational role and no operational function in a civil emergency. He has no ability to direct operational responders. In particular, as John Barradell confirms in his statement, the arrangements under the resolution for activating London Local Authority Gold are initiated by the relevant local authority or authorities. This procedure was well known to others concerned with the management of the incident in its early stages. In the event of a major incident, the Strategic Coordination Protocol comes into play, and in response to the Grenfell Tower fire, the London Resilience Group was notified for a joint assessment and a decision about the level of strategic coordination required. A strategic coordination group was considered to be the appropriate response to the Grenfell Tower fire and the first meeting was convened at 0500 hours on the 14th of June 2017. The Strategic Coordination Group brought together the various responders at a strategic level. In that context, the Mayor did not have any active operational role to play in the response to the fire itself. Although the GLA duty officer attended the Strategic Coordination Group meetings, both as a Category 1 responder and to support the Mayor's responsibilities under the Strategic Coordination Protocol, the GLA officer liaised with the responding agencies as necessary to ensure the GLA and the Mayor were kept informed of developments. In addition, in the aftermath of the fire, the GLA tasked various members of staff to assist with community engagement, communications, rehousing survivors, and building safety under the direction of the London Local Authority Gold. I turn to deal with the Mayor's role and particular actions between the 14th and the 20th of June 2017. John Paul Graham, the GLA duty officer, was notified of the Grenfell Tower fire by the London Fire Commissioner at 0309 hours on the 14th of June 2017. Mr. Graham notified the Mayor's private office, and the gold cell procedure was activated shortly thereafter, with the Mayor confirming he had knowledge of the fire at around 0320. The gold cell was a means for the senior officials in the GLA to share information and discuss what should be released to provide updates to Londoners, including the practical information in relation to road and underground closures. One of the key purposes of such messaging is to have an impact on the behaviour of the general public, and so it is crucial that the content of that messaging aligns with the operational response strategy. There was, therefore, a constant regard to what information was being released or withheld by the operational recovery teams, and that might be relevant to Londoners in general. As outlined in the Strategic Coordination Protocol, on notification of the fire at Grenfell Tower, the Mayor acted as Voice of London, with the aim of providing clear information and guidance to Londoners, consistent with the information being provided by other operational Category 1 responders. However, given the GLA did not have any operational command or control, specific communications, for those directly affected by the incident, remained the responsibility of the relevant agencies involved in the operational response. The details of the Mayor's actions during the aftermath are set out in his own statement and the statements of his Chief of Staff, David Bellamy. The Mayor's initial contact was with the operational commanders on the ground, the London Fire Commissioner and the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service. He also attended ministerial meetings and visited the scenes on a number of occasions, particularly on the 14th and 15th of June 2017, where he spoke to residents and observed the progress of the response and the recovery. By the 15th of June, when the Mayor visited the Grenfell site for the second time, it was apparent that the humanitarian side of the response was disorganised and inadequate and not meeting the needs of the BSRs. On that afternoon, the Mayor had not intended to visit the Notting Hill Methodist Church, but he was invited to do so. What he witnessed was an efficient operation in place, with volunteers sorting bed linen, sheets and food parcels, and putting clothes into bundles by gender and age group. People were hard at work, but as at the Westway Centre earlier, there did not seem to be any representatives from RBKC or central government present. Rather, the operation was being run by the church. At the church, the Mayor became aware of a large crowd gathering outside and considered strongly that it was his duty as Mayor to listen to the concerns firsthand. So, contrary to his security advice, he left via the front door and spoke and listened to the concerns of those affected. They were understandably angry and frustrated. It was clear that the system that should have been in place to assist them was not in place, or if it was, the response by state agencies was wholly unsatisfactory. The response by the local community was overwhelming, both in the context of humanitarian aid, the volume of donation, and the work of the volunteers in filling the void left by RBKC. It was apparent that there was considerable duplication of tasks. Whilst there were a large number of volunteers, proper coordination appeared to be lacking. The NGOs, such as Islamic Relief and the British Red Cross, used to dealing with disasters overseas, were very much leading the way, but they were having to improvise in lieu of any direction from RBKC or central government. RBKC was invisible if they were present at all. There was no obvious method of identifying anyone in authority. The Mayor observed that despite the amazing work and the goodwill of the volunteers, the scene was chaotic, with members of the public turning up with van loads of clothes, nappies and toys. It was impossible to identify who was there and for what purpose. The volunteers from organisations such as the British Red Cross were expressing frustration about a lack of proper coordination. The Mayor's Chief of Staff then attended the ministerial meeting which took place that afternoon at 15:30, just as the Mayor was making his way back from the scene. Nicholas Holgate attended that meeting by telephone on behalf of RBKC. It transpired that others were also concerned about the response effort by RBKC. Catherine Hammond of the Cabinet Office commented in her evidence that Nicholas Holgate was unable to articulate a plan beyond the immediate need for rehousing or explain what additional resources were required from outside the council. Stuart Wainwright, also from the Cabinet Office, expressed concerns about RBKC's capacity to cope. The Mayor's Chief of Staff was sufficiently concerned at the mounting evidence of problems on the ground that he telephoned John Barradell after the ministerial meeting to discuss what action could most helpfully be taken. John Barradell informed the Mayor's Chief of Staff that he was currently on a separate call with Nicholas Holgate and that he anticipated mutual aid would be invoked. Mr. Barradell's evidence records that it became clear to him that during that call, further support was needed, and a request for such support was made by Nicholas Holgate later that evening. The Mayor's Chief of Staff followed up with an email to John Barradell setting out the concerns with RBKC's response that had become apparent to the GLA. Of particular note was the concern, and I quote, "It's worth flagging that building a list of people known to live in the tower is something they've apparently so far failed to do." This was almost 48 hours after the start of the fire. Additional concerns were also raised in the email and confirmed what had been evident to the Mayor during his earlier visit. Communication as to what the public should and shouldn't do. Updates on social media had been sporadic. The last update from RBKC had been at 11:34 that day. A lack of responsiveness to the key agencies and to London Resilience to assist with coordination. Communication with the NGOs, particularly the British Red Cross, who had struggled to get direction. Lack of communication with those offering to help and assist financially with hotels for those affected. And lack of communication updates to others affected, e.g. those evacuated from nearby premises who did not know when they would be allowed back into their homes. The Mayor's concerns were also set out in a letter to the Prime Minister the following day on the 16th of June, the same day that his Chief of Staff attended the Grenville Recovery Task Force meeting. The Mayor attended a further Grenville Recovery Task Force meeting on Saturday the 17th of June. In that meeting, there was a discussion of what financial support should be given to families displaced from their homes, and whether this should be paid by way of a lump sum or in instalments. There appeared to be a reluctance by some to give those who needed support this payment as a lump sum. It appeared to the Mayor that there was a difference in governmental approach between the £5,000 that had previously been given by way of a lump sum to the victims of flooding and the £500 instalment that was being proposed here. The Mayor would invite your inquiry to examine whether this was a difference in approach, and if so, why. The Mayor's impression was that it was symptomatic of the prejudice and institutional indifference towards the BSRs, but it will be for the inquiry to reach its own conclusion on this issue. The Mayor attended a further meeting of the Grenfell Recovery Task Force on the 19th of June, and his Chief of Staff attended an official level task force meetings on the 18th of June and the 20th of June 2017. In keeping with his responsibilities as the voice of London, the Mayor issued a statement in relation to the main points that had been raised and discussed in the meetings on each occasion, and used social media to update members of the public of his attendance and to feed back the discussions at those meetings and reassure people he was seeking action and answers on their behalf. I turn to deal with the particular elements of resilience decision-making in the aftermath of the fire. Humanitarian aid and support to those directly affected by such an incident are fundamental elements of any emergency response. The aim is to assist people who've been displaced, and in this case, a significant number who had lost everything. In the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, this support should obviously have been a priority for RBKC, as it carried the responsibility for activating the formal arrangements for a humanitarian assistance response. It is clear from the evidence that there were many, both within RBKC and outside, who considered early on that given the scale of the incident, mutual aid should be invoked and London Local Authority Gold should take over management of the response and recovery. That is apparent from the evidence disclosed by those within RBKC. David Kerry, the contingency planning manager, recorded in his log on the 14th of June at 10 o'clock in the morning, "This incident is bigger than any one local authority in London can manage. Consideration should be given to asking for mutual aid from BECC." As you've already heard from Mr. Khan, Queen's Counsel, this morning, David Kerry had been alert to the seriousness of the position right from the start, as Stuart Priestley's log recorded at 06:30 on the 14th of June. David advised Nicholas of the mutual aid arrangements available via the LAG and our neighbouring boroughs. Nicholas stated, "That looks like we can't cope." The conversation on mutual aid at that point ended. As you have heard already, the failure to invoke mutual aid at an early stage was even more detrimental in the case of the Grenfell Tower residents, given the history of mistrust between RBKC, the TMO and the residents, which the inquiry has investigated in considerable detail in Module 3. It is clear that this community felt isolated and abandoned both before and after the fire, and this in turn contributed to the difficulties that the authorities then had in trying to regain the trust of the community at the later stages of the response. In some cases, it has understandably been incapable of repair. In its exploration of the reasons for not invoking mutual aid earlier, the inquiry will have to consider whether the leadership at RBKC was more concerned with its own reputation rather than the relief effort. Coupled with the failure to invoke mutual aid was RBKC's lack of urgency in activating a cohesive humanitarian response. This is illustrated most clearly by the fact that the first meeting of the Humanitarian Assistance Group did not take place until 2 p.m. on the 15th of June 2017. Internally, there was a perception that RBKC were continuing with business as usual, as well as attempting to deal with the response to the fire. Overall, the evidence suggests a reactive response rather than a strategic one, with each of the RBKC Gold Group acting in a vacuum without any overall strategic leadership. It is particularly telling that the first RBKC Gold Group did not take place until 11 a.m. on the 14th of June 2017. What was needed and what should have happened immediately was for an individual in RBKC or London Local Authority Gold on request to take charge and lead the strategic response with a vision to shape the response according to priority need. Undoubtedly, RBKC should have made a request for mutual aid at the earliest opportunity on the 14th of June 2017. It's clear from the evidence that the process for invoking mutual aid was known to those in leadership roles in RBKC, and that this failure had a devastating consequence upon those who had already been so catastrophically affected by the fire. Even those from within RBKC recognised the pressing need. Anne Stewart and Rebecca Blackburn both recognised that the initial response by RBKC was too slow. The BECC was too slow to open, and initial mobilisation of staff and general coordination was not great. The initial assistance offered by Charlie Parker, the Chief Executive of Westminster Council, acknowledged as being well placed to provide expertise, was rejected by Nicholas Holgate on the basis that they did not know what help was needed. It was obvious to the leader of Westminster Council, Nicky Aiken, on the morning of the 14th of June, that RBKC would not be able to cope. Furthermore, there was an assumption in central government that RBKC was one of London's best performing and competent councils. The presumption was that it would be able to respond in line with those expectations. The absence of effective strategic oversight and leadership was felt quickly on the ground. The BSRs recognised the absence of leadership, even if others did not. It was noted by individual BSRs in the immediate aftermath of the fire that the TMO, RBKC and central government were nowhere to be seen, and there was no coordination of leadership from those organisations. The BSRs therefore created their own support system. The lack of information, the absence of leadership, and the lack of a coordinated response allowed rumour and false information to gain traction and become out of control. Better communication would have prevented that from happening. Ultimately, the community deserves strategic leadership from RBKC in the aftermath of this tragedy. It was sorely lacking, and as has been described within the evidence, led to a huge vacuum into which the community had to respond and do its best to cope with what had taken place. The effect of this uncoordinated and resource-limited approach was felt by those who needed the support the most. The concerns about RBKC being raised at the London level and the central governmental level had a direct correlation with the concerns that were being experienced on the ground. It was obvious early on that RBKC did not have an adequate grip on the response and could not cope on their own. RBKC's failure to invoke mutual aid resolution at the earliest opportunity meant that when London Local Authority Gold could finally step in and take charge on the afternoon of the 16th of June, valuable time had been lost to support the community, and trust between the BSRs and the agencies tasked with helping them was already in short supply. This made the task of London Local Authority Gold much harder in leading the response after the 16th. The BSRs have highlighted a large number of issues that stem directly from the uncoordinated and resource-limited approach. These concern poor communication, a failure by RBKC and the TMO to have an up-to-date record of residents in the tower, lack of presence of RBKC or TMO officials on the ground, and the inadequate provision of temporary accommodation in hotels. Turning to deal with poor communication, intertwined in the strategic flaws in the response was a lack of communication in the immediate aftermath. This covered both communications at the site in the rest centres and also the information available to those affected by the fire via the RBKC channels. The effect of this poor communication was felt directly by the BSRs. There are examples of individuals only being able to access pre-recorded information on the RBKC housing line. Survivors describe not being able to establish what assistance was available, financial or otherwise, and having to find out everything for themselves. The lack of proactive information from the authorities made an already horrific situation even worse. RBKC had lost the community's trust by its failure to provide clear, consistent communication. And as Stuart Priestley observed, once communication was lost on the first day, it was very difficult to recover from. Information in relation to the availability of financial assistance was also sporadic, inconsistent, and sometimes wrong. This caused considerable hardship and distress. Some survivors only found out about the government fund provided for their benefit via the media and were never told officially. A number of survivors did not receive the financial assistance they were entitled to because they were not made aware of it at the appropriate time. And one of the bereaved was told in terms, and wrongly, that he was not entitled to any financial support. There was seemingly no specific department or officials within RBKC or the TMO designated to assist in the immediate aftermath of the fire with providing support and meaningful updates to the BSRs. People needed clear lines of communication and compassionate and practical assistance in their time of need. There is also evidence from the BSRs that relatives and friends of those who perished in the fire struggled to obtain information about their loved ones from the Metropolitan Police Service and the Casualty Bureau. One person, who lost many friends in the fire, struggled to find any information that was easily accessible and obtained second-hand information in the news. A mother found out that her son had died in the fire on the news. One survivor learnt about the death of his friend by seeing pictures of his body being uploaded on Facebook. A daughter whose father had died in the fire called the helpline but was never called back. She also called hospitals and the police and felt she was being batted around and not getting any information in relation to her missing father. The lack of information in the first week is described as crippling. In fact, what comes across from the very many statements in this particular issue is that the families and friends of those missing were left to find out their own information by trial and error. Regrettably, the BSRs appeared to have been provided with limited assistance by the Casualty Bureau in terms of communication regarding their missing relatives. It may well have been very difficult to provide such information about those missing, but more should have been done to keep the families updated and supported. Of equal concern, the BSRs were experiencing the effect of lack of leadership on the ground. It was apparent that RBKC were either invisible, or if they were identifiable as being present, were working without any structure or direction. Emma Spragg, the London Director for Independent Living and Crisis Response from the British Red Cross, noted that reports from her team on the ground on the first day after the fire reflected that it was difficult to identify RBKC personnel, so people did not know who was in charge or who to ask for help. Her volunteers had attended early on the morning of the 14th of June and had been unable to obtain information from RBKC as to the identification of the allocated main rest centre. They were directed to attend across a number of centres which had opened spontaneously, resulting in those volunteers being spread thinly. This resulted in the duplication of tasks, which had been noted by the Mayor on his visit on the 15th of June, and meant that insufficient support was provided to survivors from the start. The lack of a location for an official rest centre made it very difficult for the British Red Cross to distribute and focus resources. When the Westway was confirmed on the evening of the 14th of June as being the official centre, others had to be closed down and people transferred across, which inevitably added to the trauma, distress and lack of trust. It also meant that vital opportunities to obtain information about survivors and those missing in the very early part of the crisis had been lost. Many of the BSRs were unable to identify local authority or central government personnel from whom they could obtain consistent and reliable information. One of the BSRs noted, "As far as I could see, there was no one in central government, local government, or from the emergency services at the RPT taking control of the situation. We were down in the basement. Survivors were walking around in shock. I think the police turned up and started taking names. We realised that we all needed to organise ourselves and look out for ourselves because no one in authority was doing that." At the Rugby Portobello Trust, there were many organisations asking BSRs for their details, but they were unsure who they were or what they were doing there. There was no one identifiable from the TMO or RBKC to be seen or to take on the task of helping the survivors. One survivor recalled a notable absence of RBKC and the TMO, saying, "It was like they were hiding away from bereaved families. Even though some people had lost everything and needed help, they disappeared from us." The lack of visible presence from the authorities meant that the BSRs felt abandoned and unsupported. The absence of an up-to-date list of residents for Grenville Tower was a fundamental hindrance to the smooth running of the relief effort. It resulted in survivors having to repeat information about themselves and their families multiple times to different people. This increased their distress and prevented the organised distribution of money and of other humanitarian aid. The absence of a list of residents also caused distress to those who had survived and were in need of support and help. It led to one survivor providing his details at the rest centre, but being informed that someone else's details were recording of having lived in his flat, even though he had lived there for 20 years. Likewise, another individual felt that there was no proper record of tenants at Grenville Tower, and so no one knew who she was. As noted earlier in this statement, the absence of the list had been highlighted by the Mayor's Chief of Staff in his email to John Barradell on the evening of the 15th of June. However, the need to have access to such a list had also been highlighted as a result of the Adair Tower fire in 2015. Furthermore, in relation to vulnerable residents, the LFB had requested in a meeting with RBKC and the TMO officials as far back as 2012 that a list of vulnerable residents be maintained. These concerns seem to have gone unheeded. The absence of a list of known residents also had the effect on the ability of others to distribute aid effectively. As Claire Richards acknowledged on the 19th of June, that her organisation and others had agreed to share and combine lists in the absence of anything more formal. The Clement James Centre, for which she worked, did not in fact receive a list of residents until August of 2017. The lack of an accurate and up-to-date list of residents undoubtedly caused profound distress to the BSRs, but it also raised a significant number of practical issues, both for the individuals and for the authorities seeking to respond to the terrible events. It underpins very many of the legitimate concerns raised by the BSRs in their statements, particularly concerning rest centres, hotel accommodation, and the availability of financial assistance. As we've heard, there were considerable issues with the provision of hotel accommodation and food to survivors in the aftermath of the fire. There was no structure to enable the matching of accommodation with need. For example, family groups were not identified as needing more space, and those with special needs were not identified so as to accommodate their particular requirements. There had been no pre-existing agreements with hotels for the accommodation of those displaced by a major incident. as Laura Johnson accepts in her evidence, and this resulted in ad hoc placements where they were available and without any real consideration of suitability. As we've heard earlier today, the BSRs have provided the inquiry with stark examples of how this affected them. I picked just a few. A man whose wife had died was placed in sheltered accommodation with no one he knew, having just been widowed. A mother whose son had learning difficulties was not provided with any support to assist him with being displaced and disorientated after the fire. A woman with mobility issues struggled to use the bath in the bathroom of her allocated hotel room because it was not suitably adapted to take account of her needs. A family of 5 was allocated a suite with one double bed and one single bed for 5 people, including a pregnant daughter who slept on the floor. A disabled mother slept in her wheelchair because her children took the only 2 single rooms in the hotel room. Families with children were not identified as having specific requirements. A mother who had no cot for her 18-month-old daughter. For the period of 7 months, she was accommodated in a hotel. A father unable to sterilise bottles for his baby daughter. A mother struggling to get any support for her daughter's special needs while she was accommodated in a hotel. In addition, the duration of the accommodation was uncertain. One individual says he was often locked out of his accommodation because the booking had not been renewed. Many others expressed concern because they were not sure how long their booking was for, and that they were only extended at the very last moment. Some hotels gave individuals notice to leave because the booking was at an end, and still others were locked out of their rooms because the bill had not been paid. There were also cultural issues that arose as the fire took place during Ramadan, and the haphazard nature of the hotel allocations did not allow for consideration to be given to this. Some hotels could not provide a meal to enable residents to break fast in the evening. In others, the food and drink was not suitable. For some, there was no halal food and only set times for meals. The true support for the BSRs during Ramadan came from the community, who provided appropriate food for them to break the fast in the evening, with some volunteers delivering it to them in their hotels and others making it available in the rest centres. In addition to those issues that arose from failures of immediate response, there was also a very significant issue that arose from the promise by central government to rehouse survivors within a 3-week period. It was obvious to many people working on rehousing survivors that such a deadline was wholly unrealistic. Furthermore, the trauma that had been suffered by the BSRs meant that for some, the ability to make such a momentous decision was not conceivable at such an early stage after the fire. The effect was to apply significant pressure to those responsible for meeting those targets, which was in turn transferred across to the vulnerable people who felt pressurised into accepting unsuitable accommodation. In the light of all that had gone before, the 3-week rehousing timeframe was never going to be achieved and added to the distress suffered by an already traumatised community. I turn very briefly to deal with preliminary observations on recommendations. As he says in his written statement to the inquiry, the Mayor considers that the community were badly let down by RBKC's failure to acknowledge that they were overwhelmed and in need of help immediately. The humanitarian response could have been much more effective in the first days after the fire. The Mayor also has no doubt that in terms of the efficacy of the humanitarian and associated resilience arrangements, these did not work as well as they should have. RBKC's failure to invoke mutual aid immediately in the face of a tragedy of this scale was a significant reason for that, and prevented others from providing the immediate assistance at the appropriate scale that was so desperately needed. There was a serious issue with the lack of awareness of what was happening on the ground. The Strategic Coordination Group was reliant upon RBKC to provide a comprehensive picture of this, but Sue Redmond was not appointed as the Humanitarian Assistance Liaison Officer until the 15th of June. Given that the role Her role was to bring together partners, including health teams, police, voluntary and faith sectors, to oversee the humanitarian assistance effort. It was inevitable that the delays in making this appointment rendered updates on the ground from RBKC ineffectual and incomplete. The mutual aid system is designed around responders requesting help. There are clear lessons to be learned here about activating it sooner and understanding the scale and the opportunity of the support from elsewhere. Clearly, many strands of the response that should have helped those directly affected by the fire at Grenfell Tower failed to provide that assistance. This module must be used as an opportunity to ensure that improvements are made and lessons are learned. And in that way, the BSRs can at least be reassured that the horrific experiences that they testify to will not happen to others in the future.
Thank you very much. Now, after a very brief interlude for cleaning down, we'll hear a statement from Mr. Neil Sheldon, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Cabinet Office. Yes, Mr. Sheldon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the panel. As you are aware, the Cabinet Office is the sponsoring department for this inquiry and has been involved in that capacity from the outset. But this is the first occasion on which the Cabinet Office has participated in the inquiry as a core participant, and it is grateful now to have the opportunity to contribute directly to the important work of the inquiry in its consideration of the aftermath of the fire. Given that this is the first occasion on which the Cabinet Office has made submissions to the inquiry in the course of its public hearings, it wishes to start by expressing its deepest sympathies to the bereaved, the survivors, and all those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire. The tragic events of the 14th of June 2017 had a profound effect on all of those involved in dealing with the aftermath of the fire, and it continues to do so. A number of Cabinet Office witnesses have provided the inquiry with statements, and you will be hearing from one of those witnesses during the course of these hearings. But all of those involved in the response to the fire, both at the time and subsequently, wish me to make clear on their behalf their commitment to continuing to assist your inquiry in whatever way they can in ensuring that a tragedy of this nature never happens again. We understand that in this module, the focus will be on the period of 7 days after the fire. In that context, and by reference to the matters set out in issue 13, the Cabinet Office will be able to assist the inquiry in addressing the following. Firstly, the policies, procedures and plans that were in place on the part of central government in dealing with a major emergency such as the Grenfell Tower fire. Secondly, the response of central government by way of the provision of emergency relief in the 7 days immediately following the fire. And thirdly, whether that response was adequate, and if not, in what respects it was inadequate. The role played by the Cabinet Office in the aftermath of the fire was important but relatively narrow. In summary, the Cabinet Office has responsibility discharged through the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, or CCS, for, firstly, the formulation of the policy and guidance framework within which multi-agency emergency response arrangements are delivered in England, and secondly, coordinating the central government response in the event of a major emergency where the cross-cutting nature or scale of the effects requires it. In both respects, the role is primarily a coordinating one, directed at ensuring that the planning for and response to major disasters is undertaken efficiently and effectively by those parts of central government with direct responsibility for those areas. The witness evidence provided to the inquiry on behalf of the Cabinet Office comprises a total of 17 witness statements, including 3 statements of Catherine Hammond, who was the director of the CCS at the material time and who, as you know, will be giving oral evidence. The inquiry has helpfully provided very detailed lists of questions for the witnesses to address, and all of those questions have been answered. It's unnecessary for me to rehearse the detail of that evidence, but in the short time available this afternoon, it may be helpful if I outline briefly the key respects of the CCS's involvement in, firstly, the coordination of the central government response in the immediate aftermath, and secondly, the formulation of the policies, plans and procedures for dealing with an emergency of the scale and complexity of the Grenfell Tower fire. After I've done so, I will say a brief word about the extensive process that has been undertaken by the CCS to learn the lessons of this tragedy and to implement changes in relation to both planning and emergency response. Turning first to the central government response, the role of the CCS is to act in effect as the coordinating secretariat. The role is primarily directed to ensuring the smooth coordination of a process which may involve a number of different branches of government, often in circumstances of intense pressure of time. CCS does not act as a Category 1 or Category 2 responder in these circumstances, and it is not involved in the delivery of emergency response on the ground. Instead, its core function is to ensure that those parts of central government that are concerned with the emergency response are provided with up-to-date, accurate information, and that the process of cross-governmental coordination is operated efficiently and effectively, and that decisions are made well. What this involves in practice is best illustrated by the chronology of what in fact took place in the immediate aftermath of the fire. Now, a very detailed account, as you've seen, has been set out in the witness evidence, but in outline what happened was this. The Cabinet Office first became aware of the fire at 1:30 a.m. on the 14th of June, when it was identified by the National Security Secretariat watchkeepers. The news was referred to the Senior Civil Servant Duty Officer, which at the time of the fire was Catherine Hammond. She learned of the fire at 3 a.m, and at 3:49 she updated the head of the CCS Readiness and Response Team that would hold responsibility for the CCS response. A situation report was sent to, amongst others, number 10, the National Security Advisor, and the Duty Private Secretary in the Office of the Minister for the Cabinet Office shortly after 4:30. CCS duty team also contacted and informed DCLG Red. The first meeting of the Strategic Coordination Group, of which you've heard, the SCG, took place at 5 a.m. The critical question from the CCS's perspective in these first few hours was whether there was any indication of a lack of adequate resources to tackle the fire, and in particular whether the key responders, the fire service, ambulance services, the police, were flagging critical issues with resources such that assistance from central government would be required. No such issues were brought to CCS's attention at that stage. Following discussions with number 10, and also involving the CCS and the Home Office, a decision was taken to convene a cross-government ministerial meeting concerning the fire. At this point, the Home Office was the lead government department, given its policy responsibility for fire and rescue services. Although there was no information at that stage to indicate that local responders required the intervention of central government, the scale of the emergency was becoming clear, and there was a desire on the part of central government to take stock, verify the position regarding resources, and to start assessing what level of support might be required over the coming days. CCS took responsibility for making the necessary arrangements for the meeting. As described by the witnesses, this was done, as indeed it was done on subsequent occasions over the course of the next several days, in accordance with CCS's well-established process for preparing for and supporting cross-governmental coordination meetings. It's important to make clear that this process applied in essentially the same way, regardless of whether or not meetings were given the specific COBRA label. The notice of the meeting was sent out at 10:37, informing invitees that it would take place at 4 p.m. that day. Over the course of the next several hours, CCS drafted a brief for the chair, provided the chair with an oral briefing, drew up an agenda, finalised the list of attendees, and prepared the first iteration of the commonly recognised information picture, or CRIP, of which you've heard earlier. The purpose of the CRIP is to provide an up-to-date and accurate picture of the current situation, including relevant facts and figures, information relating to the scene of the emergency, any significant wider impacts, the main developments and decisions, trends, and upcoming decision points. The first ministerial meeting took place, as scheduled, at 4 p.m. on the 14th of June. The Home Office remained the lead government department, and the meeting was chaired by the Right Honourable Nick Hurd MP, the Minister for Police and Fire Services. It was attended by a mix of ministers, civil servants, and first responders, and it concluded with a list of 8 action points. CCS took responsibility for ensuring that those action points were disseminated and that they had come to the attention of the relevant individuals and agencies. It was also responsible for following up the action points by contacting the relevant department or organisation to make sure they understood what was required of them and were taking steps to achieve it. Now, this was the first of a series of cross-government meetings which took place on a daily basis during the 7 days immediately following the fire, and indeed beyond. Now, the precise format of the meetings, the list of attendees and so on, varied over time. The first 2 meetings were chaired by Nick Hurd MP. This was because the Home Office was responsible for fire and rescue services and the police, which were the 2 Category 1 responders most heavily engaged in the initial response to the fire. Thereafter, as you will know, the Prime Minister chaired the meetings on the 16th, 17th and 19th of June. Meetings of officials took place on the 18th and the 20th of June. Now, the role of the CCS in each of these meetings was essentially the same. It identified the relevant attendees, it prepared a brief for the chair of the meeting, it drew up the agenda, it ensured the CRIP was up to date, it disseminated and followed up the action points decided at the meeting. The detail of precisely what was done and by whom in respect of each meeting in the discharge of the CCS's secretariat functions is set out in the witness evidence of Catherine Hammond, Stuart Wainwright, Peter Tallentire and Paul McGlochery. The inquiry has received evidence from a number of the attendees at these meetings, and there may be a range of views about the decisions that were taken and the contributions made by individual participants. However, it is respectfully submitted that the evidence demonstrates that the secretariat function performed by CCS in support of the cross-governmental meetings convened in the 7 days following the fire was performed competently, efficiently, and in accordance with established procedures for coordinating a central government response to a major emergency. In short, the right people were given the right information in order to enable them to make well-informed decisions. Now, it was not the function of the CCS to take operational decisions about the delivery of the central government response to the Grenfell Tower fire or to deliver that response on the ground. CCS inevitably had a degree of awareness of the current situation as a result of updating the CRIP in particular, and in some cases attending the meetings. The inquiry has requested and has been provided with the views of the relevant witnesses on certain matters that arose in the immediate aftermath of the fire, but they were not present on the ground, and the decision-making as to how the cross-governmental and multi-agency response should be delivered was for the relevant local and regional bodies and the relevant government departments and agencies, and not the CCS. And I must say that any opinions expressed must be caveated accordingly, particularly given that the inquiry will be hearing from those who were directly involved. By the 17th of June 2017, CCS had started to look ahead to the recovery phase of the response to the fire and how that process might most effectively be managed. And this work was progressed alongside the continuing support provided to the daily cross-governmental meetings. Catherine Hammond exchanged some correspondence with Mark Sedwell, the then National Security Advisor on this issue, on the 17th of June, and came to the view that the scale of the task was such that DCLG, as the lead department for this phase of the response, would benefit from support, including the secondment of a Deputy Director from CCS to assist with the coordination of the recovery response. Ian Whitehouse duly transferred to DCLG for this purpose on the 19th of June, and the inquiry has statements from him explaining how he came to be involved and the nature of his role. The Transition to the recovery phase at ministerial level was also supported by CCS. On the 20th of June, a draft proposal was produced for the composition of a Grenfell Ministerial Recovery Group, along with an overview of how it should be supported. The subsequent establishment of the recovery group postdates the 7-day period on which the inquiry is focusing and is not addressed further, save to note that the CCS continued to provide secretariat support to the ministerial task force and, following the transition to recovery, the ministerial recovery group. That is an outline of the chronology relating to CCS's involvement in coordinating the central government response in the 7 days following the fire, and it is hopefully of some assistance in demonstrating the role of the CCS in this context and the manner in which that role was discharged in the particular circumstances of this case. The second relevant aspect of the CCS's role concerns the policy framework within which multi-agency emergency response arrangements in England are delivered. CCS holds responsibility for this framework, which consists of an extensive body of legislation, policy and guidance, the detail of which has been set out in the written evidence provided to the inquiry, with the most relevant identified in our written opening statement. One of the key concepts underlying this framework is subsidiarity. That is to say, local responders are usually best placed to identify the risks in their areas and to put in place appropriate plans and capability to respond to those risks. The policies and guidance produced by central government are primarily designed to assist local responders in discharging those responsibilities. Ultimately, it is for Category 1 and 2 responders to assure themselves that their plans are robust and their capabilities adequate to ensure that they are meeting their obligations under the 2004 Act and associated regulations. That said, CCS does have a high-level role in assessing the level of resilience capabilities for dealing with major emergencies across the UK is adequate, primarily through the Resilience Capability Survey, which is designed to identify any significant gaps in capability. CCS also provides training and support to local responders through the Emergency Planning College. Now, the resources in place to assist Category 1 and 2 responders in planning for and meeting the challenges posed by emergencies of various types are extensive. The starting point is the clear allocation of roles and responsibilities set out in Part 1 of the 2004 Act. All Category 1 responders are responsible for risk assessment, emergency planning, communicating with the public, information sharing, cooperation with other local responders, and promoting business continuity management. Category 2 responders are required to cooperate and share information with other Category 1 and Category 2 responders. As you've heard from Mr. Millet this morning, there is a large body of statutory and non-statutory guidance as to how these responsibilities should be discharged. Emergency preparedness is the key piece of statutory guidance, which sets out how civil protection duties should be carried out in England and Wales. It is complemented by a volume of non-statutory guidance entitled Emergency Response and Recovery, which is directed to responder agencies and is aimed primarily at developing a shared understanding of the multi-agency framework for emergency response and recovery at the local level, as well as the roles and responsibilities of individual organisations. This guidance is of particular importance when dealing with an emergency such as the Grenfell Tower fire, as it addresses the roles and responsibilities of the Category 1 and 2 responders in such a situation. In brief summary, the fire and rescue services will be expected to coordinate the response at the scene of a major fire, and local authorities are expected, amongst other things, to work with partners to ensure immediate shelter and welfare for survivors. Further guidance in this regard is set out in the Joint Emergency Service Interoperability Principles, JESIP, and associated guidance. In addition to the legislation and core guidance documents, CCS has produced a suite of guidance and policies on discrete topics. A full list is included in the spreadsheet exhibited to Catherine Hammond's first witness statement, and we've set out in the written opening the ones that are most likely to be relevant in the current context. Another key element of the risk assessment framework is the National Risk Assessment, or NRA, which in 2009 was combined with the National Security Risk Assessment, or NSRA. This is updated every 2 years and consists of a classified assessment of the risks the country faces. It forms the basis of the National Risk Register, which is a published document. CCS holds responsibility for producing the NRA. In so doing, it does not seek to anticipate every possible risk that might eventuate across the UK, but rather to group risks of a similar nature together in order to determine the planning required to respond to risks of that type. In summary, this is done by identifying reasonable worst-case scenarios and then using those scenarios to develop national resilience planning assumptions, which are then shared with local and national responders to assist them in their planning to deal with major emergencies. The inquiry has been provided with the 2016 NRA and associated documents. Catherine Hammond explains the process for producing the NRA in her second witness statement. In short, for each risk identified, there is a government department or agency that acts as the designated risk owner. The process of producing the next iteration of the NSRA requires the designated risk owners to update the risks they own, identify new risks that fall within their remit, coordinate the relevant evidence necessary to carry out the assessment of those risks. In addition, CCS commissions each designated risk owner to develop a risk scenario for each risk they own in consultation with subject matter experts and key stakeholders, and work up reasonable worst-case scenarios. The material is extensive, and the inquiry has been provided with all of it. It may be that some aspects merit more detailed consideration as the evidence unfolds, but we hope that that is a helpful overview of the structure of the risk assessment and response planning framework and the role of CCS in its formulation. Can I turn finally and very briefly to the work that's been done by the CCS since the fire to ensure that the appropriate lessons have been learned? This was a process began by the CCS at a very early stage. Catherine Hammond sent some preliminary views in an email to the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Private Secretary to the Prime Minister on the 19th of June. And she identified a number of issues at that point, as set out at paragraph 79 of her first witness statement. This was followed in July 2017 with an internal debrief and lessons identification exercise, and the key points identified during the course of that exercise are summarised in the documents referenced at paragraph 32 of our written opening. A more detailed exercise in capturing lessons learned within CCS was initiated on the 1st of August, and the CCS produced a report summarising the conclusions of that exercise on the 24th of September 2017, which has been provided to the inquiry. Whilst these lessons capture exercises provided a valuable opportunity to reflect on the response of CCS in the immediate aftermath of the fire, and to identify areas where it might be possible to refine processes and procedures to achieve greater efficiency when dealing with future emergencies of a similar nature, the overall picture from the CCS's perspective, I emphasise, was a satisfactory one. The CCS team became aware of the fire very shortly after it broke out, as it should have done, and immediately started the work of coordinating the central government response. By the time of the first ministerial meeting in the afternoon of the 14th of June, a detailed picture of the current situation had been obtained from a number of different sources and distilled into the CRIP. That meeting and the ones that came after were prepared efficiently and effectively. The large number of action points generated by those meetings were promptly communicated to the relevant government departments and agencies, and they were followed up. In general terms, the the CCS process for facilitating and coordinating a cross-governmental response at central government level to a major emergency operated as they should. Following the 2017 general election, the National Security Council commissioned a National Security Capability Review to identify how the United Kingdom could develop, deliver and deploy its national security capabilities to maximum collective effect. That review encompassed the whole gamut of national security, and CCS had responsibility for the national resilience element of it. The inquiry has been provided, again, with all of that relevant material, which identifies the recommendations that relate to national resilience most particularly, and we have flagged up in our written opening the chapter that is likely to be of most interest to the inquiry. As indeed we have identified the steps that have been taken to implement the relevant recommendations. So can I conclude by reiterating the commitment of the Cabinet Office to providing you with whatever assistance you may require in your investigation of the aftermath of the fire. We're aware that whilst a great deal has already been done by the inquiry, there is much still to do. And whilst the role of the Cabinet Office in the matters you are investigating is a relatively limited and narrow one, we're anxious to play a full and constructive part in assisting you in discharging your terms of reference. Thank you. Thank you
very much indeed. Now, again, after a brief interlude for cleaning, we shall hear an opening statement by Mr. Jason Beer, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Ministry for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Good afternoon, Mr. Beer. Now, I'm very conscious that you're running slightly late, so don't feel inhibited by that. You can have your 20 minutes, and that's no difficulty.
Thank you very much.
Right. Yes, thank you.
As you said, this statement is made on behalf of the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which I shall again refer to as the department. You will know that consistently with the approach that it has taken to the inquiry as a whole, in this module, the department has assisted and supported the inquiry, firstly by providing, by way of disclosure, thousands of documents to the inquiry. Secondly, by providing 32 witness statements to the inquiry from 21 witnesses, ranging from the then Secretary of State through the then Permanent Secretary and other senior civil servants through to junior civil servants, from which number the inquiry has selected 3 departmental witnesses to hear evidence, Dame Melanie Dawes, Dr. Joe Farrer, and Jill McManus. And thirdly, by setting out in a 49-page written opening statement its position in relation to the issues that arise in Module 4 of the inquiry, including addressing directly the qualitative question raised by the inquiry in paragraph 13C of its list of issues, namely, was the response adequate, and if not, in what respects was it inadequate? In other words, the department has itself again taken a candid, reflective, and self-critical approach. The powerful evidence submitted to the inquiry by the bereaved survivors and residents and others who lived through the days and weeks following the tragedy makes it clear that serious problems during the response undoubtedly compounded their suffering. Although Grenfell Tower was unprecedented for a residential fire in the UK, in terms of the number of people who died, the impact on those in the surrounding communities, and the level of sudden homelessness caused. And therefore, it posed significant challenges for all organisations involved in the emergency response. The department is clear that the initial response to the disaster was inadequate. In particular, the response by RBKC was inadequate. In particular, there were delays in receiving clear and accessible official information about key support mechanisms, such as rehousing and the emergency cash payments, particularly where there were language barriers, or, for example, where individuals were vulnerable. there was confusion and a lack of coordination between local government and other agencies and at rest centres. There were difficulties in identifying officials from RBKC and other organisations, including the department. There were challenges of dealing with multiple organisations and government bodies. There were issues with official representatives being available at key sites where people sought help. There was a lack of coordination of supplies of items, including clothing, in the immediate aftermath. Whilst there was a huge and positive volunteer effort and many donations from the public, this was not coordinated with official support, and many felt inappropriately reliant on such volunteer support. And there were difficulties accessing information about those who were missing or deceased. The issues that therefore arise are, in June 2017, what was the legislative and policy system in place in England and Wales to respond to a disaster such as this? Did the department perform its role before the 14th of June 2017 appropriately by reference to that system? And in the 7 days after the fire, did the department perform its role appropriately by reference to that system? So the system. A large number of core participants have in their written submissions described for the inquiry the architecture of the statutory and policy framework in preparing for and responding to civil emergencies in England and Wales in June 2017. Accordingly, I'm not going to repeat the detail of that framework now. The essential features of it, which are relevant to the issues which I am going to address, are as follows. Firstly, the 2004 Act and the 2005 regulations and the statutory and non-statutory guidance documents established a system that's firmly founded on the principle of subsidiarity. As Mr. Sheldon has just said, responders are usually best placed to identify the risks in their areas and to put appropriate plans and capability in place to respond to those risks. That's the principle of subsidiarity. Second, Category 1 responders, including local authorities, emergency services, the NHS, and the Environment Agency, have a statutory duty to assess the risk of, to plan, and to prepare for emergencies, in addition to their duty to warn and inform the public about such emergencies. Third, unless a state of emergency has been declared by the government, the department has no statutory role in responding to a disaster such as that at the Grenfell Tower. Fourth, the department had an established role under the statutory guidance through RED, the Resilience and Emergencies Division, in supporting local responders to prepare for emergencies, to act as the point of liaison between local responders and central government during an emergency, and in supporting local responders from response through to recovery. It follows that the issues for the department concerned before the disaster, did it act appropriately in supporting local responders to prepare for emergencies? And then after the disaster, did it appropriately act as the point of liaison between local responders and central government, and appropriately support local responders from response through to recovery? So I'll address those two issues in turn. The department's role and conduct before the 14th of June 2017. The department's role before an emergency occurred through engagement with local resilience forums, LRFs, the geographical areas of which are based on police areas. The department considers that its engagement with such responders through LRFs was direct and was consistent with its role as described in the Cabinet Office's guidance called Emergency Preparedness, in particular consistent with paragraphs 13.27 to 28 and 16.2. The way in which RED fulfilled those functions in practice is detailed in Jill McManus's witness statement. In summary for now, RED resilience advisors supported LRFs in their emergency planning duties at a strategic level. including making sure that LRF partners were aware of the latest legislation and government guidance, by sharing good practice from LRFs across the country, by providing information about national risks, and by supporting them in their own area-specific risk planning. Through the resilience advisors and LRFs, RED assisted in the formulation of multi-agency emergency plans and pan-London emergency plans. These plans were shared with RED at least every 3 years, and RED participated in key exercises arranged by the LRFs to test these plans. The purpose of this involvement was to help LRF partners understand the role of government in response to emergencies and to help them improve and update plans as necessary. Now, whilst this work was undertaken directly with the LRFs, RED did not, consistently with the statutory and non-statutory guidance, have a role in working directly with individual local responder organisations on a one-to-one basis, and did not, for example, review the emergency plans of the individual London boroughs or the first responder organisations that comprised the LRFs. However, the aftermath of Grenfell received a specific need to address emergency preparedness via other means in addition to the LRF, given the scale and complexity of London and the risks that it faces in comparison to other regional areas. For this reason, RED now works at a sub-regional level to support London boroughs directly and the City of London with the preparation of their emergency plans. The department's role and conduct in the 7 days after the 14th of June 2017. Firstly, I wish to address judging the adequacy of the conduct of the local responders. In the aftermath of the fire, a number of local responders had individual responsibilities. These included most notably the MPS, the LFB, and RBKC. The MPS held the function of Gold Command in the immediate response phase, meaning that it was charged with the overall coordination role. However, importantly, this did not alleviate the responsibilities of the local authority. RBKC was statutorily responsible for providing humanitarian relief in the event of an emergency, such as the tragedy at Grenfell, as their principal statutory functions and related civil contingencies involved ensuring the well-being of their community and preventing or relieving homelessness. The Home Office was the lead government department, given its policy responsibility for fire and rescue services. This was because the Home Office was responsible for the fire and rescue services and the police, which were the two Category 1 responders most occupied in the response to the fire at this time. The department's responsibility in the multi-agency and recovery phase was twofold, namely to deploy a RED government liaison officer, a GLO, whose role it was to attend the strategic coordination group meetings and relay information back to the department about the situation on the ground, and secondly, to address the issues related to the fire for which it had statutory responsibility. The department's initial response was in accordance with this established model. However, it became clear to the department on the 16th of June that there were significant failings in the humanitarian response coordinated by RBKC and led by Nicholas Paget-Brown and Nicholas Holgate. As the inquiry will have seen, multiple efforts of support were refused by RBKC, and concerns were not raised with the department through the available channels, as they should have been, by RBKC and others. This caused a delay in the full scale of the problem becoming evident, and in turn, an unacceptable detrimental effect on the experience of the bereaved survivors and residents. It also undermined the efforts of those who were working on the ground in the immediate aftermath. When concerns about RBKC's delivery of its response were raised with the department, these were escalated promptly, including to Secretary of State level, and the department took swift action alongside others to investigate and deploy support. a Director General with experience of disaster management attended the scene on the morning of the 16th of June 2017, and the department supported the permanent transfer of local authority Gold Command to John Barradell, who was in post by lunchtime on Friday the 16th of June. At the time, policy and protocol did not require a senior departmental official to attend the scene of an emergency to perform the task of judging the adequacy of the response of the local responders. Indeed, such an attendance would have been contrary to the statutory resilience model that I've just described. Applying the norms of the day, the department felt that the presence of such a senior official had the potential to divert, distract, and undermine the locally led response and add to confusion on the ground. Our position has, however, now changed. When the scale of an emergency is likely to overwhelm even the most capable and well-equipped local response, it is important for central government to have a visible presence at senior level, opening high levels channels of communication, making clear the seriousness with which government is monitoring the situation and assuring government that the response is being delivered effectively. Applying this approach, it would have been beneficial for a senior official to have attended the scene on the morning of Thursday the 15th of June at the latest. Can I address secondly rehousing commitments? Rehousing was the statutory responsibility of RBKC, pursuant to its duty to relieve or prevent homelessness. This included a duty to provide interim accommodation to eligible households who were in priority need and unintentionally homeless until they could secure a permanent home. The department's responsibility was to provide general funding for homelessness through the local government finance scheme and to set the overall policy framework through legislation and guidance. It would not usually be involved in the provision of interim or permanent housing. However, due to the exceptional circumstances of the Grenfell Tower fire and concerns raised by some BSRs that the local authority would move them to temporary or permanent accommodation outside of the borough, central government did become involved. The then Minister of State for Housing and Planning, Alok Sharma, offered a commitment that the government and RBKC would work together that made sure that displaced people would be rehoused locally. At the first Prime Minister chaired Grenfell Tower Recovery Task Force meeting on Friday the 16th of June, it was agreed that a commitment would be made to rehouse those displaced by the fire within 3 weeks. This commitment from the Prime Minister was announced on the 16th of June and confirmed in a statement to the House on the 22nd of June 2017. It was later reframed once it became clear that many families were, entirely understandably, unable to engage with the rehousing process within that timeframe. It was made clear by Ministers Alok Sharma and Nick Hurd when attending a meeting with Grenfell Tower residents on the 19th of June that those affected would not be forced to accept the first rehousing offer that they received. The department is aware that concerns were raised by RBKC that the 3-week deadline was unrealistic and that there were insufficient properties available to rehouse those displaced by the fire within that timescale. Ministers were rightly concerned at the lack of ambition and impetus in RBKC's rehousing programme and recognised how deeply inadequate this was. They rightly wished to inject a sense of urgency into this process so that those made homeless by the fire were treated with the respect and priority that they deserved and that they required. Looking back, the department is of the view that although it was right to set difficult targets with the very best intentions, the commitments in fact made were too ambitious. In particular, there was an underestimation of the strain that this would place on RBKC. Instead, the department should have sought to drive an intensity of action within RBKC by emphasising the seriousness and speed with which government, expected the rehousing effort to be handled without making the 3-week commitment. The department also recognises that it should have been clearer in the way that the commitment was communicated. It should have emphasised that affected people would be provided with temporary accommodation before being offered permanent accommodation, and that they weren't obliged to accept the first offer. In conclusion, the department remains committed to supporting those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire. In total, central government has committed over £160 million to supporting the community since 2017, including over £132 million, which has already been spent to support rehousing efforts, delivering bespoke health and wellbeing support, and the refurbishment of the Lancaster West estate. The department will continue to reflect on its role in these issues to be examined in this module and to learn the lessons of the past. The inquiry will have seen from the detail in our opening statement that the department has, since 2017, developed its systems, processes and capacity to make sure that its response to future emergencies is as effective as is possible, and will continue to make sure that where change is needed, it is implemented. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, that concludes the oral opening statements for Module 4. It's also a convenient point at which to close proceedings for today. And I think, Mr. Millet, tomorrow we expect to hear the first witnesses amongst those who were directly affected by the fire, is that right?
We do, Mr. Chairman, yes. And our first witness tomorrow morning will be Mr. Kerry Musley.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, we'll look forward to seeing Mr. Musley at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And that's all for today. So we adjourn now until 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. Thank you very much.